The morning sun barely penetrated the thick clouds over Providence, Rhode Island, as Peter Kelly huddled deeper into his worn jacket. The bitter January wind whipped through the streets, carrying the promise of more snow. At 52, Peter's weathered face told the story of a man who had seen both better days and worse nights. He carefully folded his tattered blanket and tucked it into his backpack, which contained everything he owned: a spare shirt, a toothbrush, and a small photo album that reminded him of happier times. The concrete beneath the bridge had been his home for the past 3 years, ever since the construction company he worked for went bankrupt, taking his savings with it. Peter's morning routine remained unchanged. He walked to the public restroom in the nearby park, where he washed his face and brushed his teeth. Despite living on the streets, he struggled to maintain his dignity. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, thanks to the kind barber who offered free haircuts to the homeless every month. "Morning, Mr. Kelly," called out Susan, the elderly woman who ran the coffee cart near the park entrance. She always saved yesterday's unsold bagels for the homeless people in the area. "Good morning, Susan," Peter replied with a gentle smile, accepting the paper bag she held out. "How's your grandson doing in college?" "Oh, he's doing great. Just made the dean's list," she beamed, pouring him a cup of hot coffee. "Here, it's especially cold today." This small interaction meant more to Peter than the food itself. It reminded him that he was still human, still part of society, even if most people walked past him as if he were invisible. The financial district buzzed with activity as Peter made his way to his usual spot. Men and women in expensive suits rushed past, clutching briefcases and coffee cups, their eyes fixed on their phones or the ground. He settled down near the entrance of the Providence Place Mall, placing his small cardboard sign beside him. It read, "Looking for work. Any help appreciated. God bless." Throughout the morning, Peter watched the parade of luxury cars and well-dressed professionals. He remembered when he used to be one of them, not in such an expensive suit perhaps, but with a steady job, a home, and a sense of purpose. The memory didn't bring bitterness anymore, just a quiet acceptance of life's unpredictable nature. Around noon, he spotted Carl, another homeless man who frequented the area. Carl was younger, maybe in his 30s, and struggled with problems Peter could only guess at. Today, Carl looked worse than usual, his hands shaking as he approached. "Hey, Pete," Carl mumbled, sitting down heavily beside him. "Got any extra food?" Peter reached into his bag and pulled out half of his bagel. "Here, buddy, you don't look so good today." "Bad night," Carl admitted, gratefully accepting the food. "The shelter was full, and some kids thought it would be funny to throw rocks at me while I tried to sleep in the park." Peter's jaw tightened at this news. He had experienced similar treatment, but it never got easier to hear about such cruelty. "Why don't you come stay near my spot under the bridge? It's drier there, and nobody bothers you much." Before Carl could answer, a commotion drew their attention. A group of business people was exiting the nearby office building, led by a man Peter recognized as Richard Porter, one of the regular faces in the financial district. Porter was known for his real estate developments and his habit of dropping spare change into homeless people's cups without ever making eye contact. Today, however, Porter was engaged in a heated argument with a younger man in an equally expensive suit. Their voices carried across the street. "You can't just demolish the whole neighborhood," the younger man was saying. "There are families living there, small businesses that have been around for generations." "Progress requires sacrifice, Danny," Porter replied dismissively. "The area's been declining for years. Our development will bring new life to it." Peter and Carl exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this story play out before. Old neighborhoods torn down to make way for luxury apartments and high-end shops, pushing more people toward the edges of society. As the afternoon wore on, Peter collected cans from nearby trash bins. It wasn't much, but the recycling center paid a few cents for each one, and every penny counted. He had just finished sorting his collection when he noticed a woman struggling with several heavy grocery bags across the street. Without hesitation, Peter stood up and walked over to her. "Ma'am, would you like some help with those?" The woman, middle-aged with kind eyes, hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Thank you. That would be wonderful." Peter carried the heavier bags, walking beside her for 3 blocks to her apartment building. They chatted as they walked, and he learned her name was Mary, and she worked as a librarian at the local public library. "Please, let me give you something for your help," Mary insisted when they reached her building. Peter shook his head. "No need, ma'am. Just happy to help." Mary studied him for a moment, then reached into one of the bags and pulled out an apple and a sandwich. "At least take these. And the library is always warm if you need a place to spend time during the day. We don't turn anyone away who wants to read." Peter accepted the food with gratitude, touched by her understanding. As he walked back to his spot, he reflected on how such small acts of kindness kept his spirit alive. The sandwich would be his dinner. The conversation had fed something deeper, his need to feel useful, to be treated with dignity. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings as Peter began preparing for another night. He had earned $12 today, 7 from can collection and 5 from a businessman who had asked him to help carry some boxes to his car. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a hot meal at the diner if he needed it. As he organized his belongings, Peter noticed a young woman approaching his spot. She looked nervous, clutching her purse tightly. Instead of passing by like most people did, she stopped in front of him. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I've seen you here almost every day for the past year. You helped my grandmother with her groceries last month." Peter remembered. The elderly woman with a cane who had insisted on giving him her umbrella because it had started to rain. "I work at the coffee shop around the corner," the young woman continued. "We're looking for someone to help with cleaning and maintenance in the mornings. It's only part-time, but—" She paused, seeming unsure how to continue. "I would be very interested," Peter said carefully, standing up to his full height and trying to appear as presentable as possible. "I have experience in maintenance work, and I'm reliable." The young woman nodded. "Can you come by tomorrow morning at 6? My manager wants to meet you. I told him about how you help people in the neighborhood." For the first time in months, Peter felt a spark of hope. "I'll be there," he promised. "Thank you for thinking of me." As darkness settled over Providence, Peter made his way back to his spot under the bridge. The temperature was dropping rapidly, but his heart felt warmer than it had in a long time. He carefully set up his cardboard and blankets, creating the makeshift bed he called home. Before settling in for the night, he pulled out his small photo album. By the light of a nearby street lamp, he looked at the faded picture of himself in better days, standing proudly in front of his old house. The man in the photo smiled confidently at the camera, unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. Peter tucked the album away and wrapped himself in his blankets. Tomorrow might bring a chance at something better, but for now, he was grateful for what he had, his health, his dignity, and the small kindnesses that made each day bearable. As he drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the city faded into a gentle lullaby of distant traffic and whispered promises of a new day. Little did Peter know that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would change his life forever, but that was a story for another day. For now, he slept soundly under the Providence stars, one more soul in a city full of untold stories and unexpected possibilities. The next day arrived with a mixture of promise and uncertainty. Peter woke before dawn, earlier than usual, his mind focused on the coffee shop interview. He took extra care with his appearance, using the public restroom to wash up thoroughly and comb his hair neatly. The interview went well. The manager, impressed by his punctuality and earnest manner, offered him 3 mornings a week to start. With this small victory lifting his spirits, Peter returned to his usual spot near the financial district. The morning had brought unexpected good fortune, but he had no idea that the evening would bring even more dramatic changes to his life. As the day wore on, dark clouds gathered overhead, bringing an early dusk to the city. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows between the tall buildings. Most office workers had already headed home, leaving the streets unusually quiet for a weekday evening. Peter was preparing to pack up his things when he noticed Christopher Mason leaving the gleaming glass tower across the street. Mason was well known in Providence, a self-made millionaire who had built a successful tech company from scratch. Unlike many wealthy people, Mason had a reputation for being down-to-earth, though Peter had only ever seen him from a distance. Tonight, Mason was walking alone, deeply engaged in a phone conversation. He wore an expensive gray suit and carried a leather briefcase, but something about his demeanor seemed distracted, vulnerable even. Peter's instincts, honed by years on the street, noticed something else too. 3 men who had been loitering nearby suddenly began to follow Mason. The men moved with purpose, their body language setting off alarm bells in Peter's mind. He had seen this before, predators selecting their prey. They wore dark hoodies and kept their faces partially hidden, maintaining enough distance to avoid suspicion but steadily closing the gap. Mason turned down a side street, still absorbed in his phone call, seemingly unaware of the danger behind him. The street was darker, lined with closed shops and empty parking lots. Peter knew he had to make a decision quickly. Without hesitation, he grabbed his backpack and followed. Years of living on the streets had taught him to move quietly, to observe without being noticed. He stayed far enough behind the group to avoid detection, but close enough to intervene if necessary. His heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. The three men were getting closer to Mason, who had finally ended his phone call but was now checking something on his phone screen. The soft blue glow illuminated his face, making him an even easier target. Just as Mason approached the entrance to an alley, the three men made their move. The largest of them quickly stepped in front of Mason, blocking his path, while the other two moved to cut off his escape route. "Nice evening for a walk," the large man said, his voice carrying the threatening edge. "How about you share some of that success with us?" Mason finally looked up from his phone, his face registering shock as he realized his situation. He clutched his briefcase tighter and took a step backward, but the other two men were already there. Peter knew he had seconds to act. He couldn't match the attackers in strength or numbers, but he had something else. The element of surprise and years of street-smart instincts. "Hey!" Peter shouted, his voice echoing off the buildings. In one fluid motion, he swung his heavy backpack, catching the largest attacker off guard and hitting him squarely in the shoulder. The sudden attack created confusion. Peter used this moment to his advantage, continuing to shout at the top of his lungs, "Police! Over here! Help!" His voice bounced off the buildings, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from or how many people might be responding. The three attackers, clearly not expecting resistance, hesitated. Mason, seizing the opportunity, broke free from between them. Peter grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the better-lit main street, continuing to shout for help. The noise had attracted attention. Lights were coming on in nearby buildings, and a security guard from one of the office towers was already running in their direction. The would-be thieves, realizing their plan had failed, turned and ran in the opposite direction, disappearing into the darkness of the alley. For a moment, Peter and Mason stood catching their breath. The security guard arrived, radio in hand, already calling the police. "Are you all right, Mr. Mason?" the guard asked, concerned. Mason nodded, still looking slightly shaken. Then he turned to Peter, really seeing him for the first time. You saved me. Why would you risk yourself like that?" Peter shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Couldn't just watch it happen. Nobody deserves to be attacked like that." Mason studied him with intense interest. "You're the man who sits near the Providence Place Mall, aren't you? I've seen you helping people with their packages and groceries." Before Peter could respond, two police cars arrived with flashing lights. The next hour was filled with questions and statements. Mason insisted on telling the officers how Peter had saved him, emphasizing the courage and quick thinking that had prevented the robbery. As the police finished their reports and the excitement died down, Mason turned to Peter again. "Please, let me do something to thank you. You risked your safety for a complete stranger." Peter shook his head. "No need for thanks. I just did what anyone should do." "Not everyone would," Mason said quietly. "Most people would have looked the other way. Listen, it's late and it's getting cold. At least let me buy you dinner. I know a place nearby that's still open." Peter hesitated, but something in Mason's expression told him this was more than just a thank you dinner. After a moment, he nodded. They walked to a small diner a few blocks away, one of the few places still open at this hour. As they settled into a booth, Peter couldn't help but notice the strange looks from other customers. A homeless man sitting with someone in a $1,000 suit wasn't an everyday sight. Over hot coffee and warm food, they talked. Mason asked about Peter's life, listening intently as Peter explained how a series of misfortunes had led to his current situation. He told Mason about his background in carpentry and maintenance work, and about the part-time job he had just secured at the coffee shop. "You know," Mason said thoughtfully, stirring his coffee, "my company's maintenance supervisor is retiring next month. We need someone who understands building maintenance, can manage a team, and most importantly, has good judgment and strong character." Peter looked up from his plate, hardly daring to hope. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm not offering charity," Mason said firmly. "I'm offering an opportunity to someone who has proven they have integrity and courage. The question is, are you willing to take it?" As the diner's fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, Peter felt tears welling in his eyes. He blinked them back, took a deep breath, and said the words that would change his life forever. "Yes, I am." Neither man could have known at that moment just how much their lives would change from this chance encounter, but as they continued their conversation late into the night, both felt the weight of something significant taking shape. Sometimes, the greatest opportunities come disguised as ordinary moments, and the best decisions are made not in boardrooms, but in quiet diners on cold winter nights. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that made Peter's head spin. Mason had arranged for him to stay at a small hotel near the company headquarters while more permanent arrangements could be made. For the first time in 3 years, Peter woke up in a real bed, with warm water for a shower and clean clothes that Mason's assistant had delivered the night before. The clothes were simple but new: dark slacks, button-down shirts, and a warm jacket. As Peter dressed, he caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The man looking back at him stood straighter, looked cleaner, but still carried the wisdom earned from hard years on the streets. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Peter walked into the lobby of Mason Technology Solutions. The building was impressive, 20 stories of glass and steel that seemed to touch the clouds. Inside, everything gleamed with modern efficiency. The security guard, who had been briefed about his arrival, greeted him with respect and directed him to the elevator. Mason's office was on the top floor. As Peter stepped out of the elevator, he found himself in a world that seemed from a different planet than the streets he had called home. The carpet was thick beneath his feet, and large windows offered a breathtaking view of Providence. "Good morning, Peter," Mason called out, emerging from his office with a warm smile. "Ready to see what you'll be managing?" The next few hours were a whirlwind tour of the building. Mason introduced Peter to key staff members and showed him the various systems he would be responsible for: heating, cooling, electrical, security, and maintenance. The current supervisor, Bill Rogers, joined them for part of the tour, explaining the daily operations with the patience of someone who had done this job for decades. "The biggest challenge," Bill explained as they walked through the basement level, "is keeping track of all the different contractors and schedules. We've got regular maintenance for everything from the elevators to the plants in the lobby." Peter listened carefully, taking mental notes. This was familiar territory for him. In his previous life, he had managed similar systems, though on a smaller scale. The principles were the same: keep everything running smoothly, anticipate problems before they happen, and always have a backup plan. Around noon, Mason left them to attend a meeting, and Bill continued showing Peter around. They ended up in the maintenance office, a comfortable room filled with monitors showing various building systems. "Listen," Bill said, settling into his chair, "I know where you've been. Mason told me your story. Some people might look down on that, but I'll tell you what I told him. What matters is what you do now, not where you've been." Peter appreciated the straightforward approach. "I won't let anyone down," he said simply. "I believe that," Bill replied. "You know why? Because people who've been through hard times understand something others don't: the importance of reliability. When you've had nothing, you understand the value of everything." As they continued discussing the job, Peter's mind went back to his friends from the streets. He thought about Carl, about Susan at the coffee cart, about all the people who had shown him kindness when he had nothing to give in return. Later that afternoon, Mason called Peter back to his office. The view of the city was different now, the sun casting long shadows between the buildings. "There's something else we need to discuss," Mason said, gesturing for Peter to sit. "The job comes with an apartment. It's not huge, but it's in a good building about 10 minutes from here, part of the compensation package." Peter felt overwhelmed by the generosity, but Mason held up his hand before he could speak. "Before you protest, this is standard for our maintenance supervisor. We need someone who can respond quickly to emergencies. The apartment isn't charity, it's a necessary part of the job." Peter nodded, understanding the logic but still amazed at how much his life had changed in just 24 hours. "Now," Mason continued, "I know you probably want to help others who are in the situation you were in. We have a corporate giving program, and I'd like you to be part of the committee that decides how those funds are used. Your perspective would be valuable." For the first time that day, Peter felt tears threatening to form. He blinked them back, maintaining his composure. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. "Good," Mason smiled. "One more thing. Bill will be here for another month to help you transition. Use that time well, learn everything you can from him." As Peter left the office that evening, his mind was full of plans and possibilities. He stopped by his old spot under the bridge, gathering the few possessions he had left there. His old backpack and cardboard sign seemed like relics from another life now. He found Carl in his usual spot and handed him some of his blankets and his good sleeping bag. "Things are changing for me," Peter explained. "But I won't forget about you or anyone else out here." Carl looked at him with a mixture of happiness and sadness. "You're one of the good ones, Pete. Don't let them change that about you." "Never," Peter promised. He wrote down his new work phone number on a piece of paper. "If you ever need help, or if you're ready to make a change, call me." That night, in his temporary hotel room, Peter sat by the window looking out at the city lights. The same streets that had been his home now looked different, full of possibility rather than desperation. He thought about how a single act of courage had changed everything, but more than that, he thought about how he could use this opportunity to help others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: learning the complex systems of the building, managing a team, earning the respect of people who might judge him for his past. But Peter wasn't afraid. He had survived worse challenges on these streets, and now he had something he hadn't had in years: hope. As he prepared for bed, Peter looked at his reflection one more time. The face looking back at him was the same one that had weathered 3 years of homelessness, but now it held something new: purpose. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it, not just for himself, but for everyone who was still out there, waiting for their own moment of change. Tomorrow would be the first day of his new life, and he was ready to face whatever it might bring. The streets had taught him resilience, and now it was time to put those lessons to use in a different way. 1 month had passed since Peter Kelly's life had changed dramatically. The transition from homeless man to maintenance supervisor hadn't been easy, but Peter faced each challenge with determination. The early morning walks to work felt different now. Instead of searching for a warm place to spend the day, he walked with purpose, greeting the morning coffee cart vendors as an equal rather than a supplicant. At Mason Technology Solutions, Peter had quickly earned the respect of his maintenance team. His hands-on approach and deep understanding of building systems, combined with his natural ability to relate to people at all levels, made him an effective leader. He didn't hide his past. Instead, he used his experiences to bring a unique perspective to the job. One morning, as Peter was inspecting the building's heating system, he received an urgent call from Mason's office. The company was hosting an important board meeting, and the main conference room's climate control system was acting up. Without hesitation, Peter grabbed his tools and headed upstairs. When he entered the conference room, he found Mason with several board members, all looking uncomfortable in the stuffy room. Peter quickly identified the problem. A faulty sensor was causing the system to misread the temperature. Within minutes, he had the situation under control. "This is the man I was telling you about," Mason said to the board members as Peter worked. "The one who saved me from those thugs last month." The board members looked at Peter with new interest. One of them, Linda Barrett, spoke up. "Mr. Kelly, we've heard quite a bit about you. Mr. Mason says you've revolutionized our maintenance department in just a few weeks." Peter felt his face grow warm at the praise. "Just doing my job, ma'am. A building this size needs constant attention." After fixing the system, Peter was surprised when Mason asked him to stay for part of the meeting. As he sat down at the large conference table, feeling slightly out of place in his work uniform among the suits and ties, Mason began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've asked Peter to join us because his experience relates directly to our next agenda item. As you know, we've been discussing ways to expand our corporate social responsibility program." Mason clicked to a new slide on the presentation screen. "Peter has given me some valuable insights into homelessness in our city. With his help, we've developed a proposal for a new initiative." Over the next hour, Peter found himself sharing his experiences and ideas with the board. He spoke about the challenges faced by homeless individuals trying to rejoin the workforce: lack of address for job applications, no place to clean up for interviews, no professional clothes, and most importantly, the loss of self-belief that comes from prolonged hardship. "What we need," Peter explained, "is a bridge between the streets and stable employment. program that provides not just job training, but the support services people need to make that transition successfully. The board members listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. Peter's practical knowledge and sincere desire to help others made a strong impression. "We'd like you to head this initiative, Peter," Mason announced. "Along with your current duties, of course. You understand both worlds, corporate and street life. That makes you uniquely qualified to make this program work." Peter sat back, stunned by the offer. I'd be honored," he managed to say. After the meeting, Mason pulled Peter aside. "There's something else we need to discuss. The board has approved a significant budget for this program, including a full-time coordinator position. I'd like you to consider Carl for that role." Peter's eyes widened. He had kept in touch with Carl, helping him get into a rehabilitation program and find temporary housing. "Are you sure? Carl's still getting back on his feet." Mason nodded. "Sometimes, people just need a chance. You've proven that. Besides, who better to help others make the transition than someone who's going through it himself?" That evening, Peter walked through his new apartment, still amazed at how life had changed. The walls were now decorated with a few simple paintings, and he had a comfortable chair where he could sit and read. On his coffee table lay several proposals for the new program, which he had named Bridge to Tomorrow. His phone buzzed with a text from Carl, confirming their meeting for tomorrow to discuss the coordinator position. Peter smiled, remembering their conversations under the bridge just a few weeks ago. Now they would be working together to help others find their way back. A knock at his door surprised him. Opening it, he found Susan from the coffee cart standing there with a small cake. "I heard about your program from the newspaper," she said, holding out the cake. "They interviewed Mr. Mason about it this morning. I just wanted to say how proud we all are. Everyone from the street who knows you." Peter invited her in, and they sat sharing cake and coffee. Susan told him how his story had spread through the homeless community, bringing hope to people who had given up believing in second chances. "You know what's funny?" Susan said. "Some people are calling you the bridge builder now. Not just because of the program's name, but because you're building bridges between two worlds that rarely connect." Later that night, Peter stood at his window, looking out at the city lights. The streets below held both memories of his hardest times and the promise of better days ahead for others still struggling. Tomorrow, he would start working with Carl on the program details, beginning the process of building those bridges. On his desk lay a framed newspaper clipping about the new initiative. The headline read, "From Homeless Hero to Corporate Leader, Local Man's Journey Inspires New Program." But what made Peter proudest wasn't the recognition. It was the knowledge that his experience could help others find their way home. As he prepared for bed, Peter thought about how recognition meant different things to different people. For him, true recognition wasn't about newspaper articles or boardroom presentations. It was about using his second chance to create opportunities for others. That was the kind of recognition that really mattered. 6 months had passed since Peter's life-changing encounter with Christopher Mason. The Bridge to Tomorrow program was now in full swing, operating from a renovated building near the Mason Technology Solutions headquarters. The space included shower facilities, a clothing closet for job interviews, computer stations for job searches, and classrooms for skills training. Carl had excelled in his role as program coordinator. His own journey from the streets to stability made him particularly effective at connecting with program participants. Together, he and Peter had already helped 20 people find stable jobs and housing. On this particular morning, Peter stood in front of a group of new program participants, sharing his story. The room was filled with people from different backgrounds, all united by their desire to change their lives. 6 months ago, I was sleeping under a bridge, Peter began, his voice steady and sincere. Today, I'm not here to tell you success is easy. It's not. But I am here to tell you it's possible. Among the listeners was a young woman named Betty, who reminded Peter of himself when he first started. She sat up straight, taking notes, her determination visible in every movement. After the session, she approached Peter. "Mr. Kelly," she said quietly, "I used to be a bookkeeper before everything fell apart. Do you really think someone would hire me now?" Peter smiled warmly. "As a matter of fact, we have 3 local companies looking for accounting staff. Let's get you started with some computer refresher courses, and we'll work on building your confidence back up." The program's success had attracted attention from other businesses in Providence. Mason had encouraged other companies to participate, offering job placements and funding. The local community college had partnered with them to provide certified training courses. Later that day, Peter had his weekly meeting with Mason in the executive office. The view of Providence from the 20th floor still impressed him, but now he saw the city differently, not as a place of hardship, but as a community with untapped potential. "The numbers look good, Peter," Mason said, reviewing the program's latest report. "But more importantly, the success stories are inspiring others. We've had 3 other cities contact us about setting up similar programs." Peter nodded, thinking of Betty and others like her. "We're learning as we go. Each person who comes through our doors has different needs, different challenges." "That's what makes this program special," Mason replied. "It's not one size fits all. You and Carl understand that because you've lived it." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Susan from the coffee cart, now managing the program's food service training initiative. She'd been hired 2 months ago to teach basic food service skills and help participants get their food handler certifications. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, beaming, "but Betty just aced her computer assessment. She's ready for that interview at the accounting firm." Peter couldn't help but smile. Every small victory felt personal to him. He remembered his own first days in his new position, how strange it felt to walk through the office doors as an employee rather than a homeless man. The afternoon found Peter back at the program center, helping Carl organize a new initiative, a mentorship program pairing successful participants with newcomers. The walls of the center were covered with success stories and photos of program graduates at their new jobs. "Remember when we thought this was too good to be true?" Carl asked, sorting through applications. "Now look at us. We're the ones making it true for others." Peter looked around the busy center. In one corner, a volunteer was helping someone create a resume. In another, a small group was practicing interview skills. The computer lab was full of people searching for jobs or taking online courses. "We need to add more computer stations," Peter noted, making a mental list. "And maybe expand the clothing closet." "Already ahead of you," Carl replied. "Mason approved the budget this morning. We're getting 10 new computers next week, and that empty room upstairs is being converted into a larger clothing area." As evening approached, Peter took his usual walk through the city. He still passed by his old spot under the bridge, now transformed into a small rest area with benches and a resource board listing local services for the homeless. Near the Providence Place Mall, he spotted a familiar face, a young man he'd seen panhandling there recently. Peter stopped and introduced himself, sharing a coffee and his card. "When you're ready," he said to the young man, "come see us at the center. We'll help you figure out your next steps." Back at his apartment, Peter sat down to write in his journal, a habit he'd started to document the program's progress and his personal journey. Today's entry was about Betty and her upcoming interview. A text message from Mason interrupted his writing. "Board meeting tomorrow. They want to discuss expanding the program statewide. Bring your ideas." Peter smiled, remembering how different his evenings used to be. Now, instead of worrying about finding a safe place to sleep, he worried about helping others find their paths to stability. The next morning, as he walked to work, Peter passed Susan's old coffee cart, now run by one of their program graduates. The sight reminded him of how life could come full circle in unexpected ways. Inside the office building, instead of being ignored, he was greeted with respect and warm smiles. His maintenance team had grown, now including 3 program graduates who had shown aptitude for technical work. As he prepared for the board meeting, Peter reflected on how true transformation wasn't just about changing circumstances. It was about changing perspectives, both for oneself and others. His story had become more than personal success. It had become a blueprint for hope. The sun set over Providence, casting long shadows between the buildings where Peter had once sought shelter. But now, those same streets held different promises, not of survival, but of renewal and possibility. For every person who found their way to the Bridge to Tomorrow program, there was a chance for another life to be transformed, just as his had been. And that, Peter knew, was the greatest reward of all, not the comfortable apartment or the respected position, but the ability to help others cross the bridge from despair to hope, one step at a time.